Hello guys and welcome back. If you are new around here, I cover mostly Australian cases. Today's video has been a long time coming. I'm covering part 2, or I guess not really part 2, but my follow-up video about the Claremont killer, Bradley Robert Edwards. You don't necessarily need to have seen part 1 to understand part 2, but it is going to provide you with some context and more in-depth detail on parts of today's video. However, if you aren't familiar with even the basics of the Claremont case, this video is going to be a bit of a struggle for you. So I do suggest you go watch part 1, or about 2 years ago I did a 2-part series on this actual case that you can go back and watch. Part 1 is also timestamped, as this video will be, so if there is any information that you want to easily access, you can do that. So today we're going to be discussing the trial, the evidence, the verdict, and other possible Claremont victims, and what's going to happen in the Sarah Spiers case. This, I feel like, will be more of a conversational video as well. And of course, as this was a massive case and trial, I'll be discussing the key facts only and condensing that information into about a 30-40 odd minute video. I basically want to make a 7-month trial as easy to understand as possible, which was kind of the point of this whole mini series. Before we get into it though, don't forget to like this video and comment below, come say hi. It really does help out my channel and I don't ask enough. And subscribe if you feel like this content is valuable. Social media is here. And the last thing I'm going to say before we get into it, in the words of the trial's judge, Justice Stephen Hall, this was a trial like no other. This was a trial like every other. So I thought we could start off this video by running through a few fast facts of the trial. The Claremont trial was originally due to start in May of 2019 and then moved to July, but would be pushed back several more times in the lead up. In October of 2019, in a move that shocked many, Bradley Edwards changed his plea from not guilty to guilty for both the Karrakatta and the Huntingdale crimes, both discussed in detail in part 1. Changing his plea also happened to significantly shorten the length of the trial, at least by several months. However, Edwards maintained his not guilty plea in regards to the 1996 and 1997 murders of Sarah Spiers, Jane Rimmer and Kira Glennon. So now the trial would only be focusing on the 3 murders. Now you may be wondering why he decided to plead guilty to the Karrakatta and Huntingdale crimes so late in the game, just 1 month out from the trial in fact. Did he have a change of heart? A crisis of conscience? Well, no, he didn't. The plea change was all part of the defence's strategy, which I will get into a little bit later on. Also, I think I mentioned in part 1, when Edwards was arrested in December of 2016, he was only charged with the murders of Jane and Kira. Well, a year and a bit later, in February of 2018, Edwards was also charged with the murder of Sarah Spiers. So the trial finally begins on November 25, 2019, and wraps up on June 25, 2020. It was a judge-alone trial with over 200 witnesses, all called on by the prosecution. The defense called upon 0 witnesses, and Edwards never testifies in his own defense. Remembering the whole purpose of the defense is simply to plant a seed of doubt. The trial, I believe, is considered to be one of the most expensive criminal trials in Western Australia's history, costing over $11 million to date, expected to rise with the sentencing and the potential appeals. And it was also the longest running trial in WA's history, and was surprisingly not delayed by the virus, if you were wondering. So on September 24, 2020, Justice Stephen Hall reached his verdict, which I will discuss later. And as of filming this video, we are awaiting sentencing, set at this stage for December 23rd. So the first thing that we're going to discuss are the three key pieces of evidence: the DNA, the fibres, and the propensity evidence. And I think we discussed in the last video, by the way. I'm going to try and keep very brief. So let's start with the one and only piece of DNA evidence presented at the trial that matched Bradley Edwards, the DNA found under Kira Glennon's left thumb and middle fingernail, likely obtained in a struggle with Edwards before her death. The short version of this is basically back in 2008, a male DNA profile was extracted from under Kira Glennon's fingernails, but at the time they did not know who this belonged to. The only thing they did know was that this DNA matched up to the unsolved Karrakatta rape DNA from 1995. Meaning the Claremont killer and the Karrakatta perpetrator were one and the same. So quite frankly, without this key piece of evidence, there probably would have been no trial. And this was the only DNA that linked Edwards to the murders. The defence, Paul Yovich, does try to argue that this key piece of evidence is contaminated, but we'll get into that in a moment. Next is the famous and widely discussed Fibre evidence. And I'm not going to lie, after spending, well, I guess the last year listening to this case and the last, I don't know how long doing these Claremont videos, if I never hear the word Telstra blue fibres again in my life, I'm going to be really happy. So this was also the evidence that ended up delaying the trial for several months as they continued to test fibres and uncover new evidence. A total of 98 critical fibres were presented at the trial, whittled down from roughly 4,000 found on the victims. And there were 5 different types of fibres, but they were from 2 main sources. 2 kinds of blue fibres from the shorts and pants of the Telstra uniform of the 1990s, and these fibres were specific to Telstra employees as they were made by the company Yakka with a unique dye called Telstra Navy. And just a reminder to catch anyone up that hasn't seen part 1, Bradley Edwards worked for telecommunications company Telstra, formerly Telecom, from his late teens until his arrest at age 48. The other 3 types of fibres were grey fibres that came from a VS series Holden Commodore. The 3 types being fibres from the boot, the car seats, and the main cabin. However, at the time, not only did the investigators not know where any of these fibres originated from, i.e. they didn't know the Telstra blue fibres were from Telstra, or even that the grey fibres came from a car, let alone what car model it came from. But on top of all of this, a lot of the fibres were not even discovered until years down the line. So the majority of the 98 fibres were actually found in the hair of Jane and Kira, with Jane's hair containing 27 and Kira's containing 50. And it would not be until 2012 that fibre experts were able to really look at these blue fibres on both Jane and Kira and realise that these were matching fibres. They came from the same source, which meant they could definitively say that these 2 murders were connected. Furthermore, the blue fibres were also found on the Karrakatta victims' shorts, further evidence that the Karrakatta perpetrator and the Claremont killer were one and the same. And if Edwards was admitting to the Karrakatta crime and the fibres on that victim matched up to the Claremont victims, well, it was making Edwards look pretty bad. And here's the other thing. The investigation didn't know that these mystery blue fibres were from Telstra uniforms until Edwards' arrest. And I'm sure if they had, they would have seriously been able to narrow down their suspect pool. It wasn't actually until mid-2019 that the investigation were even able to track down some original 1990s Telstra pants to test and compare to the fibres found on Jane and Kira and the Karrakatta victim. I couldn't find how they found these original 1990s Telstra work pants. I just want to know who held on to their 1995 Telstra work uniform. That would have been so hard to track down. So well done investigation. But anyway, they tracked down the pants. They tested those fibres with the fibres that they had from the victims, and they were a match. But anyway, let's quickly discuss the grey fibres before we never talk about fibres again on this channel. So these fibres were only found on Jane and Kira, and it was in 2014 when fibre experts concluded that these fibres most likely came from a vehicle, but they did not know which one. So an extensive and exhaustive search began, and eventually investigators identified a VS series Holden Commodore as the vehicle that matched the mysterious grey fibres, which was obviously a massive breakthrough as they now knew the type of vehicle that the killer drove. And Kira was also last seen talking to a man in a white Holden Commodore, which I guess somewhat confirmed this last sighting of Kira by the Burger Boys, which is a whole nother part of the trial. But if I include that, this is going to be like an hour-long video, so I've just cut it down. But if you're curious, look up Burger Boys Claremont trial on Google. And I think I mentioned this in the last video, but at this point a lot of information is blurring into one. But in the 90s, Edwards was issued with a work vehicle by Telstra for his job as a technician, and this vehicle was a VS series Holden Commodore station wagon. So quite literally the day after Edwards' arrest in 2016, investigators were able to track down and seize the exact vehicle Edwards drove back in the 90s, which now belonged to someone living in the suburb of Chidlow. And side note, can you imagine if police just randomly showed up to your house one day, not only to take away your car, but then they tell you that they think that your car was used by the Claremont serial killer? Like, this is Perth's most famous or most famous unsolved case at the time. That would have been horrifying. Oh my gosh. But anyway, the Holden Commodore, which had since had all of its Telstra insignia removed from it, although a faint outline did remain, was taken away for testing, and eventually it was discovered that not only did the grey fibres found on Jane and Kira match the fibres found in the vehicle, but 13 Telstra blue fibres were also found in the car all of these years later. Okay, so that was the breakdown of the fibre evidence. Well done if you made it through. And that is probably going to be the most explanation heavy portion of this video. So I hope that made sense. Let me know. Now let's move on to the third key piece of evidence: propensity. So before we discuss this part, because there has been a few people in my everyday life that did not know what propensity was, I'm going to quickly explain, at least how I understand it. It's basically how an individual is likely to behave based off how they have behaved in the past. So for example, the Karrakatta abduction and rape shows that Edwards has a propensity for violence. And speaking of the Karrakatta crime, this incident would end up being the only propensity evidence that would be taken into account by Justice Hall when he reached his final verdict. In court, prosecutor Carmel Barbagallo stated in relation to Karrakatta as propensity, quote, "The accused had the ability to be able to subdue, restrain, bind, hood and gag a victim, carry her and conceal her in his car without the victim being able to scream, raise the alarm or defend herself," end quote. The other propensity evidence presented in court was the Hollywood Hospital attack and the Huntingdale attack. Again, I discussed this or both of these in more detail in part 1. However, these incidents were not taken into account by Justice Hall in his final verdict. And while we are talking about evidence that was dismissed, not taken into account, etc., let's discuss what was found in Edwards' home. Again, part 1. But as a reminder, some of the items found in his home were violent stories and porn, snuff films, sandwich bags full of his semen, secured with hair ties, and DIY women's underwear. DIY in the sense that he cut a hole in them so a man could wear them. So now I'm going to be discussing what was referred to as the Telstra Living Witness Project. And this somewhat stems back to a theory or idea that the Macro Task Force, which was the task force leading the Claremont investigation, had back during the early stages of the investigation. And that was that they believed there was a man driving around Claremont and possibly the surrounding suburbs, picking up vulnerable young women, offering them lifts home, and actually dropping them off safely. The theory was that he was practicing being able to get women to trust him enough to get him into his car, which is why I think taxi drivers were considered suspects for so long. After all, what other vehicle were women feeling comfortable enough to get into besides a taxi? Well, the answer may be a service vehicle, a Telstra service vehicle, to be more specific. And my guess is this is also one of the reasons that Lance Williams was the prime suspect in this case for many, many years. Although he wasn't a taxi driver, he did drive around Claremont offering lifts to women. And when police questioned him, he told them he was being a good Samaritan. Police did begin to monitor Williams after this, following his every move. And this continued for years. Of course, we do now know that he was completely innocent. I didn't look into this myself, but I'm just thinking also the mayor of Claremont, I think, was a really massive suspect as well. Not to the level that taxi drivers were or that Lance William was. Anyway, back to what the Telstra Living Witness Project was. It was basically a group of women aged from their 40s to their 60s who had been out drinking and socialising either in Claremont or in the nearby suburb of Cottesloe around the time of the Claremont killings. And they'd all been offered lifts by a stranger as they tried to make their way home. Some of these women took the lifts and some did not. Those that did take the lift made it to their destination, and none of these women were threatened in any way by this man. However, several women did mention feeling uneasy. And this mystery man was described by the majority of the witnesses as tall with neat dark hair, driving a white car or van with a Telstra logo on it. Several of the witnesses also said the man identified himself as a Telstra employee, and one witness claimed the man said he was out looking for damsels in distress such as herself. Also interesting to note that several of these girls did mention mistaking the Telstra work vehicle for a taxi at first, but then they'd soon realise that it wasn't a taxi as the vehicle approached or as they got in, which begs the question, did Jane, Kira or Sarah think that the Telstra vehicle was a taxi, get in the vehicle, and then it was too late? I should also mention that some of these accounts did differ slightly, but overall they were fairly consistent. And this methodology of picking up women for practice actually reminds me of serial killer Ed Kemper, or the co-ed killer, who practiced picking up, according to him, 150 women and dropping them off safely before he decided to kill any of them. During these practice runs, Kemper learned how to make these women trust him. It's not so crazy to think that this was what Edwards was doing as well. Although Kemper did have a co-ed sticker or a uni sticker or something, college sticker on his car, which is why the co-ed... What is a co-ed? I don't even know. Is that a college student? Hold on, I'm going to Google this. A female student at a co-educational institution. Okay, good to know. So, like college. So anyway, Kemper had a college sticker on his car, which made the girls think that he attended, or I guess could have worked at the college, but his mother worked at the college, which is how he got the sticker. But anyway, I have Ed Kemper's definitely one of those serial killers that I find truly fascinating. If you've never watched an interview with Kemper, go on YouTube after this video and watch a interview. Fascinating, honestly fascinating. I told you this was going to be a chatty video, didn't I? But you guys will have to let me know if you prefer these more chatty videos. Like, I tell you the facts, we have a talk, I tell you the facts, we have a talk, Or do you just want me to get straight to the point and just shut the heck up? Won't be offended, but let's move on because this is going to be like an hour-long video at this point. So the defense argued that these Telstra living witnesses didn't prove anything. And if they did prove anything, it's that there may be another potential perpetrator out there. And yes, this evidence, the Telstra living witnesses as a standalone fact, doesn't prove much, but on top of everything that we already know, it doesn't look good. And I'll just throw this last fact in here because it's irrelevant to mention anywhere else. A Telstra issued knife happened to be found in Wellard on a stretch of road near where Jane was found, and was found at that same time as well when Jane was discovered. And as far as records show, there had been no Telstra technicians working out at Wellard at that time. Like Wellard was, it's like the middle of nowhere. It's semi-rural. So there was no record of any Telstra technicians doing any work at that time. So how did a Telstra knife get to Wellard? On the one hand, the knife doesn't prove anything, but on the other hand, it just adds to everything else, if you know what I mean. And I think it was worth mentioning. Now let's briefly go over the emotional upset theory presented by the prosecution. And like I've said an annoying amount of times at this point, we go over a lot of what I'm about to discuss with this theory in part 1, but in a lot more detail. So the idea behind the emotional upset theory was that every time an event occurred in Edward's life involving a breakdown of his relationship or emotional turmoil, he would go out and commit a crime. And there is a number of examples of Edward's relationship troubles coinciding with his crimes. The earliest of these is the Hollywood hospital attack that occurred one day after a fight with his girlfriend. Then there's the examples in relation to the murders. Sarah Spiers went missing just hours after he had dinner with his estranged wife, which was actually their first catch-up since she moved out of the marital home. And the reason they were estranged was because she had cheated on him with their housemate. So some pretty upsetting stuff. That same night, Edwards asks his wife to go watch the Australia Day fireworks with him, but she declines, and according to the wife, Edwards isn't really upset by this, and he heads home for the night not long after. Hours later, Sarah goes missing. Days before Jane Rimmer goes missing, Edwards finds out that his wife is now pregnant to another man, this man being the former housemate. And then days before Kira Glennon disappears, Edwards and his former wife sell their first marital home. And then days after Kira goes missing, who was the last known Claremont victim, Edwards meets his second wife, who he remains married to up until his arrest in 2016. And this was basically the emotional upset theory. However, the defense argued that these events coinciding was a matter of guesswork, and the prosecution would eventually end up withdrawing this entire argument. So we're yet to really dive into the defense's argument. So that's exactly what we're about to do. I mentioned at the beginning that roughly 1 month before the trial began, Edwards changed his plea from not guilty to guilty in relation to the Karrakatta and Huntingdale crimes. The reason for this was basically so the defence could argue that Bradley Edwards' DNA that had been sitting in the Pathwest lab since 1995, or actually since 1988, if you include the Huntingdale crimes. Anyway, the defence argued that this DNA had become contaminated with the Claremont evidence. And this is how, to quote Poljovich, a fraction of a nanogram of his DNA got under Kira Glennon's fingernails. They argued that this DNA had become contaminated with the Claremont evidence at some point in the Pathwest lab. In Poljovich's opening address, in relation to how the Pathwest lab was run, he stated, "Exhibit handling, recording, and forensic processing protocols were not always satisfactory," end quote. And in retaliation, prosecutor Carmel Barbagallo stated, "DNA within a particular sample doesn't just fly about the laboratory," end quote. And this was a quote that would become one of the more famous quotes from the trial. And this was really because, considering the defence's main argument was that the DNA became contaminated somehow, Miss Barbagallo made a really good point. How did it become contaminated? Surely DNA does not just fly around the room. And to back up the prosecution's statement, PathWest senior scientist Martin Bloom also commented at the trial, things don't just fly about. During the trial, several more PathWest scientists were called on as witnesses, and all of them said that the Claremont DNA, the Karrakatta DNA, and the Huntingdale DNA were stored in separate containers, in separate boxes, in separate areas of the lab. And when world-renowned DNA expert Jonathan Whittaker took the stand, he commented that the chances that the DNA had become contaminated were highly unlikely. However, the defense did bring up a few valid points by bringing up examples of contamination at PathWest in the past. For example, DNA from PathWest scientists had been found on some of the evidence, and another example is that DNA from a crime scene completely unrelated to Claremont was found on a twig that was removed from Jane Rimmer's body. And although these are valid examples, the defense was not able to prove in the particular case of Edward's DNA how exactly it had become contaminated. And if he couldn't prove it happened, then it remained just a possibility, a guess, an assumption. And in the end, this argument was not taken into account when Justice Hall was reaching his final verdict. And therefore, Justice Hall concluded that the DNA found under Kira Glennon's fingernails had belonged to Bradley Edwards. Also, a bit of a side note in relation to Edwards changing his plea to make this argument. By doing so, I feel like he, or the defense, took a massive risk. It was a bit of a double-edged sword because by admitting guilt at the last hour, almost 3 years after his arrest, it made him look untrustworthy and it made him out to be a liar. And on top of all of this, and maybe even worse, it showed that Edwards had a propensity for violence, for attacking random women, for abducting women in the Claremont area, no less. My personal guess, though, is maybe the defense simply had no other valid argument to make, so they had to take the chance. Of course, it didn't really work out for them, but who knows if things would have gone worse if they had not tried. And of course, Carmel Barbagello pointed out in court that if Edwards could lie for so long about Karrakatta and Huntingdale, then who's to say that he's not lying about the murders? So the defense made a similar argument when it came to the fibres. Well, sort of similar. Jovic argued that the fibres found on Jane, Kira and the Karrakatta victim could have got onto them at any point in their night, as all 3 girls had been out with friends socialising before these terrible events happened to them. Now, I could buy this argument with 1 victim, but all 3? What are the chances all 3 victims encountered very specific Telstra blue fibres and all 3 of them happened to get into VS series Holden Commodores at some point during their day or night? In particular, the defense pointed out how witnesses had seen Kira Glennon put her jacket on the floor of the place they were drinking, and the floor was quite dirty, as most pubs, bars, clubs are. And her friends had even told her to pick up the jacket because the floor was dirty. And the defense said, well, that's how the fibres got onto Kira, onto her jacket, because she put her jacket on the floor. But that might account for Kira. That doesn't account for Jane or the Karrakatta victim. And the fact that fibres from a uniform that he wore and a car that he drove ended up on all 3 of these victims, it's too coincidental, you know? And you can only have so many coincidences in situations like this. You can have 1, you can have maybe 2 coincidences, but this is a series of them basically. And if there was no DNA, I think you could very easily argue that it was another Telstra employee. But DNA plus fibres plus propensity? Anyway, I think this theory was pretty much dismissed. Another thing the defense touched on was how the modus operandi of the perpetrators differed in the Karrakatta attack and the Claremont killings. And I say perpetrators because obviously that's the whole defence's argument. Also, I don't know why I felt the need to use the term modus operandi. I always see that term in my research and books, and I've always wanted to use it. It's kind of a fun word, you know? But I feel like I'm trying to be too fancy, and I'm just not a fancy person. But basically, a modus operandi is method of doing something. So basically with the Karrakatta crime, we see almost a blitz style attack of the victim. She was suddenly attacked from behind before being abducted, raped and left for dead. However, technically we don't know how Edwards got any of the Claremont victims into his car because no one saw or heard anything. I shouldn't say no one heard anything because there was screams that were discussed in the trial. But again, if I start talking about that as well, this video is going to be painfully long. But there were screams heard by witnesses. Again, look it up in your own time if you're interested to know. But I really wanted to just stick to the most important facts that led to the verdict. That's the word I'm looking for. And the screams were not one of those things. But just know there were screams heard. But anyway, I think with the Claremont victims, we do assume that they got into Edward's car willingly. And I personally believe this to be the case as well. But who's to say Edwards didn't blitz attack them and just no one really saw anything? Of course, the only problem with this was that there were people around, so. And I'd say the victim we know the least about in her final moments is Jane Rimmer. Because we see Sarah waiting for a taxi, and obviously she's waiting for a taxi, so she's about to get into a vehicle. We had witnesses that saw Ciara Glennon talking to somebody in a vehicle, but the last sighting of Jane Rimmer is the CCTV footage. We don't see what direction she goes, we don't see if she gets into a vehicle, we don't see if she continues onto a... Gosh, we just don't know. We do not know after that moment in the CCTV where Jane went. What we also do not know is if any of the Claremont victims were sexually assaulted due to the decomposition of the bodies, or in Sarah's case, nobody. But to me, going from the Karrakatta rape to the Claremont killings, I would say Edwards was just evolving in his crimes. After all, it's not so uncommon for a criminal to escalate from rape to murder. Plus, I just don't think the crimes were so dissimilar. I mean, they were all young girls on a night out in the Claremont area, and they were all obviously violently attacked in the early hours of the morning within a similar time period. And lastly, the defense argued that Edwards would not have had enough time to kill Sarah Spiers. So Sarah went missing on January 27, just after 2 a.m, and 5-ish hours later at 7 a.m, Edwards arrives at a friend's house, looking and acting normal, according to the friend. But really, who's to say how long it takes to commit a crime like that? Plus, my guess is that killers get an adrenaline rush after a kill. So even if Edwards had little to no sleep before going to this friend's house, I think he would have been fine. But that is just my opinion. I wouldn't have a clue. I haven't killed someone. Okay, we have finally reached the portion of this video where we discuss the verdict. So let's briefly go over just a few of the reasons behind Justice Stephen Hall's decisions. As we discussed, Justice Hall did not believe the DNA was contaminated, therefore he had to conclude that the DNA found under Ciara's fingernails was that of Bradley Edwards. And what other way would the DNA get there unless he was the killer? So because Justice Hall concluded that Edwards was Ciara's killer, he then considered this part of the propensity evidence, showing that Edwards had the propensity to kill. And this also added to the Karrakatta propensity evidence. How many times can I say propensity? He then looked at the similarities between the three girls. He explained at the verdict that all three girls were abducted and killed, including Sarah. They had all been young, out in the Claremont area on the weekend, and all went missing in the early hours of the morning, between 1996 and 1997. In regards to the similarities between Ciara and Jane, he further explained that they were both found in rural areas, they both had neck injuries, and both had been covered in branches from the surrounding areas. And given the similarities between Jane and Kira, and given that it was concluded that Edwards was Kira's killer based on the DNA, it can be concluded that Bradley Edwards also killed Jane Rimmer. Now let's discuss Sarah. Her circumstances were more general. As her body has not been found, there was no DNA and there was no fibre evidence. There was only propensity. Therefore, it cannot be concluded beyond reasonable doubt that Edwards was Sarah's killer. Although Justice Hall did say that it was likely that he was the perpetrator. And the fibre evidence was also taken into account in this final verdict. So, Bradley Robert Edwards was found guilty for the murders of Jane Rimmer and Kira Glennon, and not guilty for the murder of Sarah Spiers, which I personally think, given the current evidence, is a fair conclusion. But let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Do you agree with this verdict? And if you're wondering if Edwards actually reacted to this verdict in court, well, barely. He barely responded to really anything during the 7-month trial, so I'm not really surprised. But on verdict day, I was in the overflow courtroom, so it was basically a live video stream, and you could see Edwards on this video. And his reaction when hearing he was found guilty was he closed his eyes for like a moment and he very slightly shook his head. And that is literally it, which isn't surprising for him, really. This verdict also means that Edwards is not the Claremont serial killer, but simply the Claremont killer. I know this is irrelevant, but I've heard a lot of people still refer to him as the Claremont serial killer, when in the eyes of the law at least, he has killed 2 people. And 2 kills is not actually considered a serial killer. If you were to ask my opinion though, he's a serial killer. So at this point, you may be thinking, well, what about Sarah Spiers? What about her case? Not only has she not been brought home to her family, but she didn't even get any justice after such a long case and trial. Since the verdict, people have been imploring Bradley Edwards to confess, to tell us where Sarah is hidden, even though he was literally found not guilty. Our own Premier here in WA, Mark McGowan, made a statement asking Edwards to tell us where Sarah is, to allow her family to have some closure. But here's the problem with asking Edwards to do the right thing. It's easy for us to think if he is going to be in jail for the rest of his life, or at least the majority of what's left of it, why doesn't he just confess? What does he have to lose? Remembering we don't have the death penalty here in Australia to use as a bargaining chip, and he has not been sentenced yet, so when I say he's going to spend the rest of his life behind bars, it's a guess. Although I can't see any other possible outcome to 2 murder convictions at aged 50. But anyway, as I was saying, what does Edwards have to lose in confessing? It's pretty funny because our former police commissioner, Carl O'Callaghan himself, said that Edwards had nothing to lose if he confessed to killing Sarah. But I could not disagree more. I mean, for one, he would gain another murder conviction, and yeah, he does already have 2, but that's still better than 3. But more importantly, for Edwards at least, is that by confessing this piece of information, he would lose his last form of control, or his last bargaining chip, you may say. Let's not forget that everything has been taken away from him at this point. His freedom, his life, his friends, his family, and rightly so. But no matter what they do to him, they can throw him in solitary, do what they want, whatever. There is one single thing that they can never take away from him, and that is his knowledge of where Sarah Spiers is. If you are to believe that he is guilty of her murder, which I personally do. But also, I don't believe he's going to give up that piece of information for anything. He'll take it to the grave. And I mean, he hasn't confessed to killing Jane or Kira at this point, so why would he confess to killing Sarah? It'll make him look like even more of a liar. Plus, we're hardly talking about an individual with a heart or soul here. Why would he care about the Spiers family and how they're suffering? I think the only chance that they have of getting a confession out of him is either offering Edwards total immunity from being charged with Sarah's murder for the sake of closure for her family, and then maybe offering something on top of that, like a lighter sentence or prison privileges even. But would that ever happen though? Who knows? The only real hope Sarah's case has, in my opinion, is if her remains are found. At the very least, it would provide some closure for her family. And personally, I think that she could be somewhere in Wellard where Jane was found, Edward's first victim, because killers tend to stick to familiar territory until they're found out. And considering Jane really was found by sheer chance, he probably thought it was a pretty safe area, although I'm sure police have thoroughly searched Wellard at this point. And then there's the problem that if Sarah's remains are found, what's going to be left of them at this point is going to be bones. And I suspect no DNA, no fibres, and in general no forensic evidence will remain after all of these years. I guess the only thing that you could argue in court if Sarah's remains were found in Wellard or even Eglinton, which is where Kira was found, is propensity. If Edwards took one victim to this location and Sarah's found at that location, then chances are Edwards is the killer, if that makes sense. But again, unless Edwards has a change of heart, a crisis of conscience, or becomes a born-again Christian, he isn't going to say where Sarah is, in my opinion. I did also want to discuss the topic of possible other victims before we wrap up, and this sort of ties in with something discussed during the trial, but pretty much ended up being dismissed. And that is something called the homicide pattern. Basically meaning if a number of people are killed in the same area around the same time, it is more likely that they were killed by the same person. Makes sense. So let's go over a few of the unsolved Perth cases that people have connected to the Claremont killer, Bradley Edwards. I think Julie Cutler would have to be the name that comes up the most frequently in relation to Claremont. And from memory, her family also believe that it's possible that Julie was a victim of the Claremont killer. Although the year of her disappearance may be a little too early in Edwards' crime timeline. I do have an entire video about Julie Cutler, so I'll try not to waffle on for too long, but basically in 1988, 22-year-old Julie Cutler left a work function at the Parmelia Hilton Hotel in Perth, where she worked, just after midnight on June 20. Her car was found 2 days later in the ocean, 50 metres off Cottesloe Beach, upside down and crushed. In the car were several champagne flutes from the Parmelia Hilton, filters from a brand of cigarettes that Julie didn't even smoke, her car keys still in the ignition, and her headlights were still on, as well as the back seat of her car missing, which would eventually wash up to shore. However, there was no sign of Julie. Something else interesting to note here was that her rear door didn't lock. I'll leave that video down below though in case you want to look more into that case. But I pretty much think her case is the only case where there is a small possibility that Edwards was involved, but honestly, I doubt it. We then have 19-year-old Lisa Brown, who went missing from Northbridge in November of 1998. But I don't know much about this case, to be honest, so I won't comment any further. We also have 20-year-old Sarah McMahon. Again, I have a video about her case. I'll link it below. She disappeared in November of 2000 after leaving work in Claremont to meet up with a friend in the suburb of Bassendean. But despite her going missing basically from Claremont, I, along with many others, do not think this one is connected to Claremont or the Claremont killer, because it is pretty clear who did kill her. And that's all I'll say on that. And lastly, 18-year-old Carrie Turner, who was last seen in the suburb of Victoria Park in June of 1991. However, her body was actually found 1 month later in the Canning Dam, but her murder has never been solved. And just to be the most annoying and repetitive person ever, my Carrie Turner video is linked down below. So what is next in the Claremont serial killer saga? At this point, we're awaiting Edward's sentencing, set for December 23, where we will find out how many years he receives for 2 murders, plus the Karrakatta and Huntingdale crimes. And at the time of recording this, Edwards has, surprisingly, I guess, maybe not, he has not appealed. And I do want to say a massive thank you to the Claremont The Trial podcast for providing over 100 episodes of information about the trial and the place where I and many others learned everything that we know about this entire case and trial. It was like my favourite podcast. Well done. And if you live in WA, they're doing a live show of the podcast. Why did that sound sponsored? It totally wasn't, obviously, but check it out if you're local. Like, comment, share, subscribe, all of that fun stuff. It really does help out my channel. A massive thank you to my channel members. You are all absolute stars. Until next time, stay vigilant, stay safe, and I will see you very soon. Bye guys.